This is the story of Ethan Caldwell and his wife, Vanessa Caldwell. They had built a life the way most people build them, carefully at first, then by habit, then by inertia. Ethan was a man who expressed love through consistency. The coffee made before she woke, the bills paid without discussion, the way he remembered the name of her childhood dog, even when she seemed to have forgotten it herself. Vanessa was brilliant and restless, a woman who had always needed more than a room could hold, and who had married Ethan believing that steadiness was the same thing as safety. For 11 years, it nearly was. The tension between them was not the loud kind it lived in the pauses after dinner, in the way she laughed harder at other people's jokes, and the particular silence that had grown between them like a plant no one remembers planting. This is a story about how love doesn't always die. Sometimes it just stops being tended, and the two people responsible for it look away at exactly the same moment. The house had a rhythm to it that Ethan had come to depend on more than he realized. 6:15, the alarm. 6:40, the shower running in the master bath while he made coffee in the kitchen. The specific domestic choreography of two people who had shared mornings for over a decade. He would hear her heels on the hardwood at 7:20, always rushing, always 5 minutes behind herself, and he would hand her the travel mug without being asked, because he had learned the exact temperature she needed it, the precise ratio of oat milk to dark roast that she'd never told him, but he'd figured out by paying attention. "Thank you," she would say, "but in the way you think an appliance." He noticed that. He had been noticing it for a while. Vanessa Caldwell was 41, a partner at a mid-sized marketing consultancy, and she moved through the world with the particular energy of someone who had always been the most interesting person in any given room and had privately come to expect this. She was not unkind. That was the thing Ethan returned to again and again in the quiet hours he spent in his home office reviewing contract language while she was at events, or dinners, or meetings that ran late. She was not unkind, she was simply elsewhere. Physically present and emotionally at altitude, like a flight that had lifted off years ago and never quite landed back. Ethan was 43. He ran a small structural engineering consultancy from the second bedroom they converted after deferring the decision so many times it became a decision not to have children. He was the kind of man people described as solid, which was sometimes a compliment and sometimes just a way of saying he didn't demand much from the air around him. He listened well. He fixed things. He did not make scenes. Their daughter, the absence of her, was one of the hairline cracks neither of them pressed on anymore. On a Tuesday in October, Ethan came home to find Vanessa already there, which was unusual. She was at the kitchen island with her laptop open and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and for a moment before she registered his presence. He saw her in the way you sometimes see a stranger, as a person entirely separate from the story he told himself about their marriage. She looked tired. She looked like she was carrying something she hadn't told him about. "You're home early," he said. The 4 o'clock canceled. She didn't look up. "There's leftover pasta." He warmed it himself. They ate on opposite sides of the island, her reading emails, him pretending to read the news on his phone. The pasta was good. The silence was the particular kind that has stopped being comfortable and started being practiced. "Marcus Hale is throwing a gala next month," she said eventually. "The firm's sponsoring a table. I need a date." She said it the way she might say, "I need someone to carry the heavier grocery bags." Functional. Logistical. "Sure," Ethan said. She looked up then, and there was a flicker of something across her face, relief maybe, or something more complicated. The look of a person who expected resistance and didn't know what to do with its absence. "It's formal," she added, as if warning him. "I own a suit, Vanessa." "I know." She went back to her screen. "I just wanted to be clear." Later in bed, with the lamp still on her side because she always read before sleeping, Ethan lay in the dark and thought about the way she'd said, "I need a date." Not "I want you there," not "come with me." The specific grammar of a marriage contracting inward. He didn't say anything. He closed his eyes, listened to the occasional soft turn of a digital page, and felt with quiet precision the thing he had been feeling for perhaps 2 years now. The sensation of a room slowly losing heat, not through any single broken window, but through 100 small drafts he hadn't been able to find and seal. He thought about fixing it. He usually thought about fixing it. He fell asleep before he could decide how. November arrived the way it always did in their city gray, and without ceremony, the trees finally giving up. In the 3 weeks before the gala, Ethan noticed things he catalogued the way he catalogued structural concerns in the buildings he assessed. Not with alarm, but with the methodical attention of someone building a picture. Vanessa's phone faced down more often than it used to. She had started going to the gym on Thursday evenings, which she hadn't done since her mid-30s. She laughed at something on her screen once, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And when he asked what was funny, she said, "Just a work thing," and closed the app. None of it was proof of anything, he knew that. But there is a particular intelligence that long-term intimacy produces, a kind of sonar built from 11 years of learning another person's frequencies, and his sonar was registering something. He mentioned it once, obliquely. "You seem lighter lately," he said. They were in the car, coming back from her firm's client dinner. One of 2 per year he attended because she needed a body in the seat, and he was the most convenient body. She was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" "I don't know." "More." He searched for the word. "Present." "Present," she repeated, and her tone was a closed door. "You make that sound like a criticism." "I didn't mean it as one." The silence stretched until they pulled into the driveway, and then she was out of the car before he'd cut the engine. Heels on the gravel, already inside, the threshold crossed so smoothly it could almost pass for normal. He sat in the car for a few minutes. The engine ticked as it cooled. She didn't deny it, he thought. And then, deny what exactly? At work the following week, he had coffee with his oldest friend, a divorce attorney named Daniel Price, who had the particular dry humor of someone who spent his days watching marriages disassemble. They had been friends since college. Daniel knew Ethan well enough to know when he wasn't talking about what he was talking about. "You're asking me something," Daniel said, over a flat white he didn't seem to be enjoying. "I'm not asking anything, I'm just thinking out loud." "You never think out loud." Daniel set down the cup. "You think in the basement for 6 months and then come up with a finished conclusion." Ethan smiled at that despite himself. "Marcus Hale," he said. "Vanessa's been working with his firm." Daniel didn't change his expression, but something behind his eyes settled. "Hale's a good-looking guy, separated, I think, from his second wife." "I didn't say anything." "No," Daniel agreed. "You didn't." They talked about other things after that. Daniel's daughter's school play, a property dispute Ethan had been consulted on. But before they parted, Daniel touched his arm briefly, the way men do when words feel too direct. "If you ever want to think out loud in a more professional capacity," he said, "my calendar's flexible." Ethan drove home with that sentence sitting in the passenger seat. That night, Vanessa was working late legitimately. He had no reason to doubt it, and he sat in his office for an hour without doing anything. Then he opened his laptop and began reading, quietly and carefully, about the legal framework for marital asset division in their state. Not because he had decided anything, just because the information existed, and he was the kind of man who preferred to understand the landscape before he found himself standing in it. It felt like a betrayal of her, researching this. It also felt, uncomfortably, like taking care of himself for the first time in years. He thought, briefly, of the travel mug. 6 years of handing it to her in the right temperature, the right ratio, unremarked. He thought about what you call a person who pays that quality of attention to someone who has stopped reciprocating it. He closed the laptop. He didn't have an answer. He just knew the question was no longer abstract. Then, midway through the following week, he was helping her choose which earrings to wear to a lunch meeting she always asked, and he always answered. And he had wondered lately if she was asking him or just asking the room, and she was looking in the mirror and he was standing behind her, and for a strange moment the interaction felt observed. Vanessa tilted her head at his reflection. "What?" "Nothing." He was quiet a beat, just thinking. "About?" He almost said it. Instead, he looked somewhere just past her shoulder at the middle distance and said quietly, "I don't know. Maybe." He paused with a kind of odd self-awareness, as though listening to himself from outside. "Maybe like this story, or subscribe or something." Vanessa turned from the mirror slowly. "What? Nothing." He straightened. "The gold ones. Where are the gold ones?" She held his gaze for a moment with a look that was mostly confusion and a small, uncomfortable fraction of something she couldn't name. Then she put in the gold earrings and the moment passed, swallowed back into the ordinary furniture of their morning. The Marcus Hale Gala was held on a Saturday in late November at the Meridian Club, one of those old downtown venues that smelled of mahogany and legacy money. Vanessa wore a deep green dress that Ethan had never seen before. She looked extraordinary in it, and he told her so in the car, and she said thank you without quite looking at him. The room was the kind designed to make you feel you'd arrived somewhere. High ceilings, soft light, the particular den of 200 people performing their best versions of themselves. Ethan navigated it with the quiet competence of someone who had attended enough of these events to know they were mostly theater. He got drinks at the bar. He talked to a structural engineer he vaguely knew. He watched from the edge of the room as Vanessa moved through the crowd with the ease she always had in professional spaces. More alive here, he thought, than she'd been in their kitchen in years. He found her near the tall windows, talking to Marcus Hale. He had seen photographs. The man was tall, early 50s, the kind of weathered handsome that reads as authority. He was leaning toward Vanessa with the body language of someone who had already decided the evening was going well, and Vanessa, she was laughing, not performing a laugh. Laughing, with her whole face, in the way she used to laugh when they were first together, when he could still surprise her. And his hand was at her waist. And her hand was at his arm, and neither of them was treating this as unusual. Ethan stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. He did not feel the hot surge he might have expected. He felt instead something colder and more clarifying, the sensation of a thing he'd suspected becoming a thing he'd seen. The difference between the two is enormous. One is a question you can live with. The other changes the spatial arrangement of everything. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. He got his coat from the cloakroom. He left. She did not notice. He was nearly certain of this. In the car, and then at home, and then sitting in his office with a glass of whiskey, he didn't much want. He sat with the specific desolation of being the person in a relationship who pays enough attention to notice when the other person has stopped. He called Daniel the next morning. "I need that conversation," he said. "My calendar's flexible," Daniel said, exactly as he'd said it before. They met Monday. By Wednesday, Ethan had a preliminary consultation on file and a clearer understanding of his options than he'd had 72 hours ago. By the following Monday, he had spoken to his bank about separating his personal investment account's money that was his before the marriage, and which, under the terms he now understood, he was entitled to move. He did this quietly without anger, the way he approached structural assessments methodically, starting with what was load-bearing. On Tuesday evening, Vanessa came home and said, "I barely saw you at the gala. You disappeared." He looked up from his book. "I wasn't feeling well." "I told you." He hadn't, actually. "I left early." She studied him briefly. "You should have said something. You were busy." The sentence landed between them and lay there. She picked up her bag from the counter and went upstairs. And he watched her go, and he thought, she believed that. She heard you were busy, and it did not occur to her that it was anything other than a neutral observation. That was the thing about being consistently overlooked. When you finally began to withdraw, the other person didn't recognize it as withdrawal because they hadn't been watching closely enough to notice the change. That night, he slept in the guest room for the first time, citing a headache. She didn't check on him. He lay in the unfamiliar dark and felt, very quietly, the shape of the decision that had already been made. January came. Then February. The separation, he had not yet used that word to Vanessa, though it lived in every paper Daniel had on file, expressed itself as a kind of managed distance. He moved most of his daily life into the guest room under the cover of his described insomnia, which was genuine, though not for the reasons he gave. He continued to make coffee. He continued to hand it to her. He had not entirely figured out why he kept doing this, and he tried not to examine it too closely. Vanessa, for her part, had restructured the story. He understood this not from anything she said directly, but from the way she spoke around the edges of things. She had decided he could see the shape of it, even if she never articulated it, that Ethan was going through something, a midlife contraction, a professional stall. She spoke to her sister on the phone once while he was in the adjacent room, her voice low, but not quite low enough. He's just been very internal lately. Withdrawn, untrying to give him space. She had made herself the patient partner. She had made his withdrawal about him. He did not correct this. Correcting it would have required a conversation he had already decided would happen on his terms at a time of his choosing, and not before. In March, Marcus Hale's name appeared in a news item about a real estate development dispute. Ethan read the article without particular feeling. He had stopped building a case against Hale. It wasn't, he realized, about Hale. It had never been about Hale exactly. Hale was simply the point at which a pattern had become visible. The pattern itself had been constructed over years, by both of them in different ways. He started running again, something he hadn't done since his early 30s. 3 mornings a week, before Vanessa was up, the city still gray and quiet. He was not doing it to punish her or to transform himself for narrative purposes. He simply needed to be somewhere that was only his. His colleague, a younger engineer named Patrick, noticed the change in him first. "You seem different," Patrick said over lunch. "In what way?" Patrick thought about it. "Less braced," he said finally. "Like you're not waiting for something to hit you." Ethan considered that. "Maybe," he said. In April, he had a second meeting with Daniel, this one more substantive. Papers were drafted, not filed yet, but drafted. He held them in his hands for a moment before folding them into the briefcase, struck by the strange lightness of a decision that had been made so slowly he could not point to the moment it had become final. There had been no explosion, no dramatic revelation. He had not confronted her over the gala, had not named what he saw, had not demanded or accused, and perhaps that was its own kind of distance. The thing Vanessa had always called his detachment, and he had always thought of as composure. Maybe they were both right. In early May, Vanessa mentioned at dinner that she and Marcus had successfully closed a major account together. She said it the way people mention things they half want you to ask about and half dread you asking about. He congratulated her. He meant it genuinely. She was good at her work, always had been. She looked at him with an expression that crossed into confusion. "You're not going to ask anything else?" she said. "What would I ask?" She was quiet. "Then you've been different lately, Ethan." "I know." She waited for more. He offered the exact amount of silence required. "I don't know how to read you anymore," she said. "You never really tried," he said. "Not with heat, not with accusation, just as a plain and measurable fact." And then he stood up and carried his plate to the sink, because the conversation was over in all the ways that mattered. She stayed at the table for a long time afterward. He told her on a Wednesday evening in June. He had chosen the day with no particular calculation. It was simply the day that arrived after enough days had passed, and he was no longer willing to keep things arranged around her convenience. He had the papers. He had a plan. He had had for several months now a clearer sense of himself than he'd had in years, which was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all that. The process of ending the marriage had returned him to something he'd lost inside it. He was sitting in the living room when she came home. He had not prepared a speech. Speeches were not his register. "Sit down," he said when she dropped her bag. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. Something in his stillness registered. She sat. He told her that he was filing for divorce. He told her that he'd been in consultation with a lawyer for several months. He told her calmly, with complete precision, that he had seen her with Marcus Hale at the gala in November, and that the seeing of it had clarified something he'd been trying to understand for longer than that. She was very still during this. "Then, you've been planning this since November?" "I've been understanding it since November," he said. "I've been planning it more recently. And you just lived here." Like nothing. I lived here, he agreed, like we had been living. I didn't think it would be a significant departure. That landed. He watched it land. Her jaw tightened and then relaxed, and she looked away toward the window with the expression of someone reckoning with the truth they have no good argument against. It wasn't what you think, she said, quietly, with Marcus. I'm not asking about Marcus. Then what are you asking? I'm not asking anything, he said. I'm telling you. She turned back to him, and for the first time in years, maybe many years, she was looking at him with her full attention, not processing the room behind him, not half somewhere else, looking at him. And he understood, with the particular sadness of being right about something you wish you were wrong about, that she had not looked at him this way in so long because she had decided at some point that he was not the kind of person who required it. She had believed he would absorb anything, that stillness was the same as acceptance, that a man who didn't shout didn't have limits. Ethan, you don't have to say anything tonight, he said. He stood. Daniel's information is in the folder on the kitchen counter. He's fair. He'll do right by both of us. He went upstairs. He did not slam the door. He sat on the edge of the guest bed's bed, now really, and listened to the house, which was quiet in an entirely different way than it had been quiet before. He heard her eventually in the kitchen, the soft sound of a folder being opened, pages turned. He lay back and looked at the ceiling. He was not happy. He was not relieved. He was something more complicated than either the particular emotional weather of a person who has finally stopped waiting for a storm and simply walked inside. He thought without bitterness of the travel mug, the 6 years of the right temperature, the right ratio, the careful, unremarked attention. He understood now that he had not done that for her. He had done it because it was the kind of person he wanted to be. Someone who paid attention, who showed up, who tended things. He could be that person somewhere else. He could be that person for himself. Downstairs, after a long time, he heard Vanessa set the folder down. He heard nothing after that. No crying, no footsteps toward the stairs, no knock at the door, just the house settling, as houses do, into its nighttime sounds. In the morning, he made coffee. He made 1 cup. He drank it by the kitchen window, watching the early light find the garden, and he let the silence be only his.